Welcome to this session of the Ancestral Healing Summit. I'm Lisa Bonise, your host, and my guest for this session is Dr. Ariel Schwartz. Our topic today is Cultivating Transgenerational Resilience, Healing Ancestral Trauma. Dr. Ariel Schwartz is a licensed clinical psychologist, certified complex trauma professional, and yoga teacher with a private practice in Boulder, Colorado. Her integrative mind-body approach to therapy includes relational therapy, parts work therapy, somatic psychology, EMDR therapy, and therapeutic yoga for trauma. Ariel, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. It's so good to see you again.
Thank you, Lisa. It's always a joy to be here with you.
Yes, and I'm so looking forward to this conversation because we've talked about other things in the past and we haven't really talked about ancestral trauma before. So if you would, tell us, how did you become interested in ancestral trauma?
I think that I first gained an interest in this during my pregnancy with my daughter, who is now 19. So it'll give you a little bit of a timeline of when this became forefront in my own consciousness. And I think that sometimes we are brought to areas of healing by our life circumstances. And this was certainly one of those for me. And in part because my pregnancy with her was actually quite difficult. I was very sick. I had hyperemesis. I threw up for 8 months. I lost a lot of weight rather than gaining weight during my pregnancy. And so it really sent me into another layer of my own therapeutic healing journey. And what began to arise in that process of attending to my own soma, to how my body was speaking to me in a sense through these symptoms, was actually experiences related to my own experience of coming into the world, even in utero, and what I felt like was being carried in my mother's body based on her life experiences and what it meant for her to come into the world, and so on and so forth. So a long tail of a journey, and one that I think often motivates a lot of people to heal those ancestral wounds, because there's this feeling of, I don't want to carry this forward into the next generation.
Yes, absolutely. I can absolutely relate to that phrase. Yeah. So would you be willing to maybe share a key moment in your own journey? In addition, maybe expand on the story that you've just told?
Yes, yeah, gladly. I think that there has been many layers of working through that trauma over the years. In part, maybe the initial layers were attending to what I knew in a story about my mother's coming into the world. So her mother's pregnancy with her was my grandmother's pregnancy. Sometimes it's tricky. Who are we talking about? My grandmother's pregnancy was an unexpected pregnancy, and my grandmother was 49 when she became pregnant with my mom. And this was 1941 when my mom was born. So if you think about the time in the world, and so my mother was told that her grandmother tried to end the pregnancy multiple times. That kind of impact actually carries through pretty profoundly. And we can even read some of the research about the impact of those stress cortisols during pregnancy and what can happen in the influence of the child. And thankfully, my mom, who has done a lot of her own healing work, had really done a lot to change what kind of gets carried through the river and that impacted me. But nonetheless, I could really feel that there were the sensory experiences informing me of what was incomplete in that story. And now if I fast forward actually quite a timeline later, maybe another 5-6 years after my daughter was born, I started to have dreams about my grandmother, my mother's mother. She started to show up in a way that actually awakened me to this realization that perhaps this person who had been a source of adversity might become an ally for me. And so I started to do some dialoguing with my maternal grandmother. And she would show up in dreams, and she would show up in certain therapeutic workings that I was engaged in. And this feeling of her own willingness to kind of take back the burden and my own willingness to hand it back, and a realization that it wasn't my job to carry that wound, to carry that burden. not for my mom, certainly not for my grandmother. And then I'm going to fast forward to 2022, to earlier this year. And I was sitting in meditation. And Lisa, I know a little bit of your interest in this field, and I know you will really understand this story, because I was sitting in meditation maybe the day after on the news, we had all seen how Russia began to invade Ukraine. And there was a convoy of tanks heading into Kyiv. And as I sat down for meditation that morning, I had a very strong download. Go to your family tree. You need to look at your family tree. And so I came out of meditation. Thankfully, I had a relative that had done a lot of ancestry investigation and had written up our family tree and some family stories, but I had never really studied it. And so I pulled it out of my file cabinet. And as I looked at it, I saw that my grandmother's mother was born in Kyiv. It gets pronounced in multiple ways. So she was born there and had her first pregnancy at the age of 12. I know, right? And my grandmother was the third of those pregnancies. And by the age of 21, now I can imagine in my own mind's eye, my great-grandmother with two young children, pregnant with my grandmother. And suddenly, or maybe not so suddenly, the Jews are being placed in pogroms. And they had to flee their country. And so the word that had come to me in meditation was motherland. And this deep felt experience of watching current day people needing to flee their home and knowing that that lives in my own cellular matrix. And as she's pregnant with my grandmother, having to leave her mother, leave her motherland, leave her mother tongue. And something in the very fibers of my being knew that this was a story that was ready to be uncovered and to unwind through how it has been carried in my own soma.
Oh my goodness. I need to just not say anything for a moment and just absorb what you just said. Even though that is not my experience, I can absolutely feel what you're talking about, the concept of losing the motherland, the mother tongue, the fracturing of motherness was profound, deeply profound. So as you began, I guess, integrating, assimilating, what I'm not sure what words you would use, how did you feel that this changed you?
Yeah, I'm going to be honest. I think it's still changing me. I really believe that this is very long-term work, that we don't necessarily do kind of like one ancestral healing process and it's all done. It's all tied in a little knot. I think that it's been so fibrous. It's been so integrated into so many layers of who I am, both in very nourishing, positive ways. When we speak about transgenerational resilience, I would say that it's really strengthened a sense of my own purpose and sense of deep valuing that I am here, that I am carrying forth this lineage, that this conversation, even going back to my ancestors of saying, we did it, we survived. And the unwinding has really kind of had me look at where my body has still been caught in a flight pattern, where I still feel like it hasn't been quite so safe to reside in my body, even in our country, which of course has reactivated a lot of these patterns of not feeling protected or safe, especially as a Jewish woman. So there's been layers of it kind of continuing to unwind. And maybe the last thing I'll say in response to that question is how my own body continues to be the part of me that leads the way. I can't really think myself through this because I have to keep coming back and attending to where my cells and my body knows. So sometimes it's through dream work or through body work or through somatic kind of dialoguing, whether it's on my yoga mat or in therapy, but continuing to really attend to the impact that this has here.
Yeah. Such powerful words. And thank you for letting me ask that. I know it's a sort of a tender question. I don't want to, poke too hard, but thank you. Thank you for letting me do that. In fact, it brings up just, if you don't mind, let's continue the conversation about mother healing, et cetera. In my great grandmother, she gave birth 11 times and
Yeah.
only 4 of them lived. And so I try to imagine what it would have been like, because there was no birth control back in the old days. You just, every year or two, you're cranking out another baby. And so she was pregnant so many times, and many of them died. I see from the genealogy records, they would die within hours or days of their birth. And then for 5 years, there were no recorded births. So I'm assuming she had miscarriages until finally one baby lived. So I can only imagine what that child, who is like, there's 11 years difference between her older sister and her, and she was the last child, what kind of epigenetic trauma would have been passed through to this child, who the mother would fear. Is she going to die? Is she going to survive? Do I want this child? Can I connect with this child? Because it hurts so badly to lose them. What are your thoughts on just the whole mother issue in general? How can we address this within ourselves? Because even men deal with this. It's not just those of us who give birth.
So true. And thank you for sharing some of your story. It's so powerful. And I think the first piece that strikes me is that you have cultivated a coherent narrative about your family history. And I believe that that's very often part of this path towards healing, is that we are needing to, in some ways, kind of be ancestral detectives, right? And that we put on that detective hat and we go back and we start to study, and we look at those genealogical records and we start to get curious about it. And we start to explore how this have impacted them. What is it like to live in their world? How would it have felt to have lost child after child, and to go through that excitement, fear, loss cycle again and again? And your question being, how then might this impact the child that's finally born after all of these losses, accumulated losses? And I really do sense that grief lingers. It lingers in the womb, it lingers in our bodies, and it informs our earliest, most core sense of self. And so we don't have words sometimes, we don't have stories for that. And that's why the coherent narrative comes later. Most often, the way that we're trying to organize our understanding of these events is by kind of sensing into, how does my body respond when I think about this, this grandmother or great grandmother, whoever it might be, that went through these life experiences? And now what begins to move inside of me? In what ways might those emotions that didn't get fully digested or processed, such as fear or anger or grief, sadness, all of those big emotions, what kind of support did they have to process that back then? Maybe, maybe not. And then what gets kind of carried forth both epigenetically. So if we look at, some of the research about the epigenetics of transgenerational trauma, we can see how the unresolved post-traumatic stress of the mother can be reflected in changes in how the infant is processing cortisol, or primary stress hormone. And so it can lead that child to then perhaps have more colic or be harder to soothe, and it can impact the attachment relationship. We also can see how, because infants are very right-brained, they're emotion processors, they're sensing and feeling the voice tone, the expression on the face. What is not owned by the mother gets still expressed. It doesn't mean that it doesn't come across. And so the infant might be experiencing, and then later toddler and young child, these emotions, almost like I think of them as kind of ghosts in the relational space. And they'll land in that right brain. They'll land in the implicit memory system or the felt sense, but we might not know what it is we're feeling or why we're feeling that way. So now, if we fast forward into adulthood and we start to look at those stories and we unpack, and we might go, I wonder. I wonder if that's why I had these feelings as a child, or I wonder if that's why I developed these symptoms of illness, right? We can get curious about how these things can get kind of carried forward.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a lot to think about. And I don't want to dwell on my story. I want to ask you more questions, but thank you for allowing me to bring that in. So today we're talking about cultivating resilience. And I know you have so many wonderful practices. So what are the practices that you find that best support resilience, in the face of not just historical traumas, as we're talking about, but also the ongoing traumatic events, as you were mentioning, the war in Ukraine? We face these day to day. What would you say to that?
Yeah. I've been studying resilience and post-traumatic growth for at least 10 years, and really trying to kind of put my heart and wrap my mind around what are the factors that lead some people to respond to adversity with strength and empowerment and courage, and other people feel like it just takes them down somatically, emotionally, psychologically. And so the first thing that I really want to say about resilience is that it's not just something you were born with, although I do think that there are ways in which we might be born a little bit more physiologically capable to handle challenge based on these epigenetic factors. But mostly the research points to the fact that resilience is something that we practice. This is something that we cultivate through repeated actions and how we're thinking about ourselves and how we're thinking about the world. And so it's these mindset, it's these actions that we can repeatedly practice that strengthens our resilience over time. The factors that I've distilled around resilience in my studying of this, one of them really is that mindset. It's that ability to recognize that we can grow through adversity, that hard things can ultimately, if we put our mind to it, if we put our heart to it, can be something that we grow through. And the other factor around resilience, or another one, is what we call self-efficacy, which is basically the belief that my actions are going to make a difference in the outcome of my life. And what's tricky about self-efficacy is that generally that gets strengthened through our earliest life experiences. For example, if you're a child and you're sad and you're crying, and that cry is actually a social experience. It's a social reach to say, I'm suffering, I'm hurt. And will somebody come and help me attend to that so that I'm not so alone with that difficult experience? And so self-efficacy is learned by the fact that how I feel is valued. It's important. If I ask for help, someone will show up. So if we don't have those early life experiences that my actions can lead to a positive consequence, then we're more likely to feel like no matter what I do, it's not going to make a difference. So I feel like self-efficacy is something that then we really need to attend to and grow and cultivate. And we can study, when I do A, what begins to happen, what begins to change, and we can create these microcosms. It's one of the reasons why I love my yoga practice, is that I can wake up in the morning and do a breath work and do some movement practice. And I can study the fact that I feel more open, more receptive, more compassionate, more kind, right? And that can carry with me throughout the day. So I know that taking that time made a difference in the outcome of my day. And then we can grow that feeling that my actions are important. And ideally, we have relational repair experiences where we find safe and secure relational experiences, where I can say something and it can be received or responded to in a loving way. And then I can restore a sense of faith in that social connectivity and my own ability to create that. which ties into another factor of resilience. I'll say this is the third one, which is not isolating, staying connected. That social connectedness, even if it's just with one single person who takes an interest in your inner world and what's important to you, that makes a difference in the outcome of adversity. We know that someone is willing to attend with us. And then the last two that I'll name of these 5 factors, mindset, self-efficacy, connectedness. The next one would be coherence. And that's what I named before of you have this coherent narrative about your history. You have an ability to make sense of who you are, why you are the way you are based on what has happened in your life, what contributing factors have shaped you. And then the last factor is action. It's our willingness to take all of that and to not just use it for my own self-betterment, although that's completely valid, but also in some way to step back into the world and to know that I might be able to participate in creating meaningful change within the very systems that have been a source of adversity.
Mhm. All right. I do have a question let's rewind to the beginning of what you were talking about how sometimes a child, if you're crying and you're hoping for help and the help comes, that's very reassuring. What if you had the kind of childhood where help didn't come? Does that sort of disconnect your ability to follow through with the next steps, or is there a way that can be repaired?
I'm a deep believer in the repair journey, and I wouldn't be a psychologist if I didn't believe in that. And I know from personal experience and as well as professional experience and the research literature that these types of wounds can be repaired. And that does allow us to reclaim that resilience that is, I believe, our birthright. But it really does require a safe and trustworthy relational experience. I don't believe that we can repair those kinds of relational wounds solely on our own. We need to have that opportunity with another person who's willing to lean in and to bear witness to what occurred so that we can attend to it. When we don't have that witness, I think that's when we're much more likely to pass this on to the next generation. For example, one of the most common generational wounds is a role reversal, in which the child feels responsible for the parent's pain. And so if the adult hasn't found that repair, hasn't found a therapist or a community member, a church member, right? Somebody that is willing to bear witness, to be in relationship with you to your pain. If we don't have that, sometimes the parent looks to the child to be that empathic other. And then we can start to see how this can distort where the burden really needs to lie.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It also brings up another question, though, that I know that I've had this experience myself, not to any extreme degree, but I understand what it feels like. Well, nobody cared about me. Well, how important then is it to sort of harken back to the ancestral stories? Let's talk about your great grandmother, I believe it was, pregnant at 12, facing incredible adversity that you and I today couldn't even begin to relate to because that's not our reality. How could this young woman, this young girl, possibly have been able to respond to her baby's every single need when the world is blowing up around her? Do you think it's important for us to know their stories in order for us to heal that epigenetic wound, or can we do that without? Because some people will never know what their ancestors went through.
You just took the words right out of my mouth. I think that is really what is so challenging about this is that, you and I both have access to some of these genealogical records, but many, many people do not know these stories. And so now it's kind of like having to listen to other forms of communication and to trust those other forms of communication. So in some ways, what our body carries the story regardless in those implicit memories. And an implicit memory is not a story memory. It's not a narrative. It's not verbal. An implicit memory is a felt sense, and it's an emotional experience. And sometimes it even shows up as a physical symptom of illness. And so when we are attending to the internal experience, to the very real here and now experience of feeling shut down. Personally, I'm a migraine sufferer, and they're often tied into this generational healing for me. So, say for example, we're working with that symptom of the migraine. I might not even know exactly what it's connected to, but if I'm attending to that with qualities of loving kindness and compassion and reaching for help to someone who's a trustworthy other, if I can find repair now, even if I don't totally know the story of the past, but maybe have some kind of broad general sense, like, my family came from, or what was happening in the world at the time that they were living there, or, here's the time when they left that country and what were the circumstances that surrounded that. I might not know the direct stream of my own family lineage and their immediate story, but I might be able to contextualize what the felt sense in me of where fear lives, where hopelessness lives, where despair lives, where shame lives. And there's a different feeling when we localize that in our own history, and when we kind of broaden out to be curious as to where our personal history is interrelated to that generational history. Maybe the feeling is a little bit more energetic or broad sweeping, rather than, again, that very specific narrative. But part of how we develop transgenerational resilience is by taking ownership of at least what I am going to bring to the world now. Who am I? What is the wake that I might leave behind me for the generations that come after? How do I take responsibility for that, even if I don't know exactly the wakes that have impacted me?
Mhm. Okay. All right. Now, if you don't mind, I want to change the subject just a bit. I've heard you in the past talking about the importance of developing an oscillating narrative, and it feels like that would be appropriate to bring up. Would you explain what that means and how we accomplish this?
Yeah, absolutely. So this came out of some research that was looking at children and resilience. And that this research study, it's often termed the ties that bind us, was looking at children who knew stories of their ancestral history and children that didn't. And what they found is that the more that children knew about their family history, the higher they were scoring on resilience measures. And so what they looked at were things like a set of questions that you might ask a child of, like, do you know where your parents met? Do you know stories about what your grandparents have been through? Do you know why Aunt so-and-so has that grumpy look on her face every time we go to Thanksgiving, right? So it starts to kind of help a child process what they are seeing and sensing and feeling by then maybe being able to say, what you might not know about Aunt so-and-so is that she faced this hard experience. She lost a child, and she carries within her that deep grief, and that Thanksgiving is so hard because she's with the nieces and nephews, and she never got to have that experience, right? So we might hold that. But here's the piece: the oscillating narrative is kind of like this way in which we then can deliver for a child the coherent narrative that talks both about the hardships, but also the strengths and resilience factors that has helped people overcome those hardships. I'll give an example from my own history. So my husband's brother was killed in a helicopter crash. He was in the military in the special operations. His helicopter went down on a Al-Qaeda mission shortly after 9/11. And that story is very integral in our own family life because he died a year before I became pregnant with my daughter. Actually 3 months before I went into labor, the 1-year anniversary of his death. So very integral in our family system. So when we talk about the loss of Kurt, we talk about the hardship and the pain and the grief that Grandma Arlene experienced with losing her son, and we acknowledge that pain and that Daddy lost his brother and how painful that was, and we also speak about how it really bonded us and that we were newlyweds and that we really had to step in together to process that grief, and how it tied us in such a deep, meaningful way around something so big that happened early on in our marriage. And then there was the difficulty of, the experience of after his death and what we were continuing to go through and continuing to process that loss. But then I became pregnant. And so now we were also expecting a new child. And so we can kind of hold these both and qualities, and how Grandma reached out to friends for support and they really helped her, and how she, has his picture in their home, and we go and we visit it and we see his picture. And of course we have his photo in our home. So we weave these stories in a way that it isn't all or nothing. It's not only the pain and loss, but it's not sugarcoating it either.
Yeah. Wow. That's an amazing story. But let's talk, but got to ask you, there's another term that you use called transgenerational empathy. How does that tie in with what you were just talking about?
Yeah. The story that I shared about the aunt with the grumpy face, it's probably a great example of it, where actually as we build in these oscillating narratives and these conversations with children as well as us as adults, of being able to see that both the hardship as well as the strength. I was thinking before about, kind of what did it take of my own grandmother to survive what she went through. And even though it's not always what we think of as a strength, it took a tremendous amount of stoicism. And I can see that stoicism in how in the photos even of my grandmother's face, right? So that was my great grandmother. I see my grandmother is very stoic. I see my mom as carrying that stoicism. Stoicism for me is a mixed bag. So I'm trying to unwind how stoicism sometimes makes me just kind of push through something without stopping and sensing and feeling. And so I've been able to both appreciate that stoicism and have empathy for how it served her, how it helped our family lineage survive, how without that stoicism, perhaps I wouldn't be here. And so what we talk about with transgenerational empathy is basically, what does it mean to imagine stepping into the shoes of that ancestor, imagining them in the context of their lives? What was happening? What were they facing? Who helped them through it? What were the missing pieces? What support did they not have? Right? And again, sometimes it's just guesswork because we don't totally know that story. So I would love to invite you and our listeners to take a moment and just join me in a brief practice of this. If you'd like to engage in this, perhaps take a moment to reflect upon someone from your own ancestral lineage. And I will encourage you for this very first experiment with this to perhaps not choose the most difficult relative, right? The one where there's just no access to any healing, or the one that where there was incest or abuse or those kinds of things. That can be a really big piece. And I also want to say that you don't ever have to forgive. That doesn't have to be part of this journey. Okay. But what I will invite you to do for this exercise in transgenerational empathy is to choose an ancestor or a relative who has enough of a sense for you of wellness. It could be a parent or a grandparent, could be even a story you know about a great grandparent. And take a moment to imagine them. If you were to kind of create a snapshot of a little Polaroid picture of a day in the life of that person. And I love, that there's some of these photos behind you, Lisa. It kind of gives those reference points, right? We can imagine a day in the life of that person. And as you imagine that Polaroid picture, where were they? You might even imagine what they were wearing, whether they're alone or with other people. So now we're giving a little bit of a storyline to this person. We can broaden that storyline. What was happening in the world at that time? What was happening in the world at that time? So you've got this Polaroid picture of that ancestor you've chosen. And where are they? Are they alone or with other people? What are they wearing? And what was happening in the world at that time? What might they have seen or heard? What might they have seen or heard? How might they have felt? So if you think about this snapshot in time, this particular story, and what was happening in the world, what they might have seen or heard, and how might they have felt? And now the invitation is to come back to you and take a moment and notice, what are you feeling as you reflect upon that person, that ancestor, in that snapshot? Because you are now the living embodied legacy, and you're deeply connected. How do you feel as you imagine them? Perhaps even imagining walking a day in their shoes. And as you attend to your own felt sense, our bodies carry within the unfinished business, right? So you might notice what feels incomplete. Is there an emotion that arises? Is there a longing that arises? Our minds are also very capable of deep imaginal healing. And you might even sense, what was the needed, necessary repair right at that time? Did they need someone to bear witness? Did they need someone to offer nurturance and care? Did they need someone to protect them? And as you come back to yourself and your very own body, notice what happens if you allow yourself to imagine bringing in that repair process of whatever that missing experience might have been. Deep acceptance and nurturance, wise guide, protector, a witness. And again, ask your body, right? Listen deep into your own soma. What feels like it needs to happen next? And we could spend much more time with this than, of course, we would have time here. And I encourage you to continue to let this unfold and inform you. But I want to bring it back to one really key piece before we close, which is now, when you think about that ancestor and their presence in the world and perhaps their influence on your very own life, what do you feel towards them now? How do you feel towards them now? And you might begin to notice, and you might need more time for this, but you might begin to notice a little bit of spontaneous appreciation or gratitude arise. Or even just those words, We're here. I'm here. We made it. You can bring that gratitude right back around to yourself, because this empathy for other is really no different than the empathy that we can cultivate for ourselves as well. And the beautiful kind of understanding of transgenerational empathy is that not only does it provide more of that care and compassion for the generations that preceded us, but also for the generations that will come after us.
Right. Wow. That was surprisingly powerful given the fact that, I'm working and I can't really dive deep, et cetera. And I also know a lot about this person and I like this person. So there's not a lot of icky there. But I'm wondering then, you mentioned to start with somebody who doesn't have a lot of triggery energy. What would be the process then to begin to work with somebody who you're kind of holding at arm's reach? Do you work your way into that, or is there a different process that you recommend?
What I would say is that if we kind of look at one of those elements of the missing experiences, we might start with the first person that was injured by that ancestor, if that was you or if that was your parent or so on and so forth. And we start with the person that was injured, and we recognize that what was missing was that they weren't protected. So we can start actually by bringing in the protection. You can bring protection in for you, because that's necessary. When we're dealing with dark energy or evil or abuse, those kinds of words, right? It's big energy, and we actually really need protectors. So I would start by finding well ancestors, and I would start by really surrounding yourself with protector figures that can actually help hold that clear space, so that you can choose how far away you want that unwell or damaging ancestor, the one that was the source of adversity. You can work with them at the other end of a football field or on another planet if you want, right? You get to choose how far away you want them so that they cannot hurt you anymore. And you can feel the difference in my voice tone, right? They cannot hurt you anymore. And I get a little fierce when I do that work because it's important. We need that feeling of the protector in the room.
All right. Wow. Well, beautiful advice. Thank you. I'm so glad I asked that question. Now, again, changing the subject, because I want to sort of rewind. You mentioned that you have your daily yoga practice. And I know that in your work, working with the body is very important. So how is it important when it comes specifically to healing generational trauma?
Yeah. I'm going to share another story because I think sometimes it's where it comes home. And this story was doing a piece of work that's called a constellation, a family constellation, and it's a piece of work very influenced by a man named Bert Hellinger. And I went to do a family constellation around my mother's lineage, same lineage we've been speaking about. And what we did was we basically had, in this case, because it wasn't with a group of people, it was just me working with the therapist who was guiding this, we used different kind of mats on the floor that represented the different generations and different members of the family. And at one point, the therapist gave me this bowl of very heavy boulders, like big, heavy rocks, because the feeling in me is that I was carrying the burdens. What absolutely kind of blew my mind in this event was that the counsel was to hand back, and to recognize that what had been handed to me was actually not my responsibility to carry anymore. And so the process of handing back, and by giving it a physical form in these heavy boulders, and I took this basket of the heavy boulders and I sent them back through my mother, through my grandmother, to the great grandmother, until you can feel that there's a broad enough field that can finally hold it and take responsibility for it. And in this process, what moved through my body, going back to your question, was the whole room began to spin. I was brought to the floor on my knees. I thought I was going to throw up. It was such a profound somatic unwinding that became clear that the organization of my even identity, my sense of self, my proprioceptive being was organized around a gravitas, the weight of something. And by letting that go, it required that I reorganize my sense of self. And there was a disorientation before reclaiming a new orientation of myself and to the world. So it's a very extreme story. And of course, it doesn't always look or feel just like that. But what I would say is that the body is the path forward. Our bodies are our path forward because of how these kinds of memories are passed on. They're passed on somatically. They're not, yes, we might know the story, but really they're carried in us, and sometimes carried in us in the forms of migraines or fibromyalgia or fatigue symptoms or post-traumatic stress symptoms.
Wow, that's again, wow. Sometimes I just need to sit here and go, wow. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that one as well. So then we're so close to being out of time. I want to keep talking to you, but I want to ask, so what can help us to actually foster post-traumatic growth?
Lovely. I would say that if we define post-traumatic growth as a belief in our ability to work through the difficult feelings of terror, rage, despair, grief, shame, right? Really heavy stuff. It's not that, it's because those feelings can feel like they're just going to shut us down. They're going to stop our growth. And it's the belief that we have the capacity to work through that and to come out the other side, ultimately to discover a greater sense of freedom, of hope for ourselves, of hope for the future. And what fosters that is a commitment to your own healing journey, a recognition that most of us need people to accompany us on that healing journey. I often liken it to a hero's journey, and that we gather allies and we gather our team that helps us walk through the darkness to come out the other side into the light. And that through that process, we are able to reclaim the core gifts of why you're here. What is it that you're supposed to awaken to, maybe even give back to the world? And that through that, we get to ultimately cultivate a recognition, I'm stronger than I ever realized I was, or that these people were around me just there to love me, but I was so afraid I didn't let their love in, and now I can allow that in. These are those signals that something new is emerging, just like a new green sprout that's coming up through the earth, and it needs to be protected at first before it can ultimately flourish and take us into places that perhaps we could have never dreamed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. As you were talking, I must have this in me that I need to work out, because it's a similar question to what I came up with earlier, where what if at the beginning stages of what you were talking about, you feel stuck, where you were saying by facing what you're looking at, what is the pain, what is it that you don't want to address, what's the stuck point, is it going to hurt as bad looking at it again as it did when it happened? If that's your sticking point, how do you work through that, work past it? I don't even know the words to ask the right question.
You're asking brilliant questions, and I'm actually really glad that you're asking these kind of nitty-gritty questions of like, what does it really look like, Ariel? Like when you're in there and you got someone and they're really stuck, or when you felt really stuck, right? Because it happens all the time. And I guess my first response to it is that stuckness is normal. You're not doing something wrong. Even Fritz Perls in his model of Gestalt therapy identified impasse as one of the stages of healing, and that the impasse is actually very much part of the journey. We will bump up against those stuck experiences within us. And that allows us to actually sometimes feel defeated, sometimes want to retreat, but ultimately to progress forward, we recognize that we do need to cultivate that inner strength and those tools. So speaking in very layman's terms for a moment, outside of the kind of flowery language of a hero's journey, from a trauma healing perspective, we need to gather our resources. We need to build the access to states of empowerment and safety, or safe enough, and to the experience that I have choices now that weren't available then, or that my ancestors didn't have. So we gather these resources and we spend as much time there as we need to, so that by the time we approach that stuckness, we have new ways of looking through. It's like we've gathered enough candles to generate this bright enough light that it actually can illuminate those dark spaces.
All right. Wow. Thank you again for letting me ask the questions. I so appreciate your time. We are, darn it, out of time. I want to make sure that before we go any further that I mention your website. It's drarielschwartz.com, and doctor is DR with no period. So drarielschwartz.com. What will people find if they visit you there?
All right, there's lots there. You can kind of go down a rabbit hole of trauma-informed care and resilience-informed care. I have a blog that I have kept for about 8 years with many, many, many articles. You will find information about my books, and you will also find information about my YouTube channel, which has free practices and yoga classes. You're also welcome to join me for a live on Zoom yoga class, which I teach regularly. So lots of fun there.
Lots of good stuff. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Ariel. I have learned so much, and I just enjoy being in your presence. Thank you for that. Is there anything that we've left out that you want to make sure that we talk about?
I'm just going to emphasize one last thing. Again, it's not that we haven't talked about it, but I feel like sometimes resilience gets kind of chalked up to this inside job. And I just want to emphasize again that actually resilience is very much about how much access we have to resources, including the resources of other people. And it's what I really love about collaborating with you in the Shift Network, is that you have been able to really create very accessible resources to many, many people, countless people. And I'm grateful to be able to participate with that.
Well, we're grateful to have you. Thank you again. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
I want to remind everybody that I've been talking with Dr. Ariel Schwartz, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this conversation in the Ancestral Healing Summit.